Hello and welcome to the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press, the podcast that brings you advice and conversation from authors, teachers and academics. I'm hosting today's episode. My name's Adam and I'm a brand marketer from the press. I look after this podcast, but also the education blog, which is called the Brighter Thinking blog, which is where you can find lots of teaching tips, free resources and downloadable activities. If you haven't already, make sure to check that out. You can find the link in the show notes. Today, we're going to be discussing positive peace. If you don't know what that is, fear not. We'll be revealing all from what it is to classroom benefits, but also the wider benefits too. So let's meet our guests. Today, I have with me Professor Hilary Cremin, Peace Education Research Professor at the University of Cambridge. Hilary is an experienced and senior academic who researches, writes and teaches about peace education and conflict transformation in schools and communities. She's also worked in the public, private and voluntary sector as a school teacher, educational consultant, project coordinator and academic. Welcome, Hilary.
Thank you very much.
We're also joined by Hema Mistry. Hema is an education manager with the Teaching and Learning Division at Cambridge Assessment International Education, leading Cambridge School Improvement Services. Hema helps school leaders to reflect on their school's performance and effectiveness against the Cambridge School self-evaluation standards and to focus on developing a plan which addresses the key issues raised through the process. Hema has been working on developing new evaluation tools and services to uncover what is getting in the way of learning and interventions to support schools through their next steps and beyond. Welcome, Hema.
Hello, Adam.
Great. So remember, all the links and info that we discuss are available in the show notes. And if you want to get your voice heard on a future show, you can get in touch on Twitter. That's @CEP Education and use the hashtag BrighterPod. Finally, please remember to like, review and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. So before we dive into today's topic, we have a little icebreaker so that listeners can get to know you. What I'd like to know is, what were your first experiences of peace? So Hilary, let's start with you.
Ooh, my first experiences of peace. It has to be associated with nature because I've always loved nature from my earliest memories. So I have a memory of being in a meadow in long, tall grass and looking at the insects and poking sticks in a stream and so on. I seem to remember we weren't supervised. It wouldn't happen today, would it? But we were allowed to run feral, really. I think I learned a lot about life in that meadow. I must have been less than 7 because I moved out after my 7th birthday. So I think probably being in a meadow.
That does sound very peaceful.
Is what brings me peace, or brought me peace, is my earliest memory.
Sounds very nice. And Hema, same question to you.
So my earliest memory of peace is chanting, actually, Om Shanti. Shanti in Hinduism means peace. And I was introduced to that when I was about 4 years old. My maternal grandparents follow Satya Sai Baba, who is a guru in India, and his teachings are very peace-orientated. His motto is love all, serve all, and that's where I first learned about peace. I have to say that's the underpinning of most of what I try to do, although it doesn't always work out that way. But essentially that's where my first experiences were.
Excellent, thank you, and a great motto. The icebreaker gives you a little bit of an indication of what we're going to talk about today, and we'll dive into those questions now. My first question is perhaps an obvious one. What is positive peace?
Big question. Okay, so I suppose the first way to explain it is by looking at what it's not. So clearly it's not negative peace. And that in and of itself sounds like quite a tricky concept, doesn't it? Because we always think of peace as automatically being a positive concept. Well, negative peace is what happens when we suppress direct violence, but we don't actually address the underlying causes. So people talk about pacification, don't they? And sometimes when people think about peace education, they think it's about pacification, and it can have a bad press because people think it's not about actually addressing all the really big issues. So we want to move beyond keeping the peace, simply making sure that direct violence doesn't happen by keeping warring parties apart, for example, or by separating young people who are experiencing conflict in school and not allowing them to come into contact with each other, or having, CCTV or high fences. These things may well be stopping direct conflict and violence in a school, but they're not bringing about positive peace. So positive peace is where we address that indirect violence, the structural violence, the cultural violence that you get in wider society and in schools, that permeates throughout our structures, our institutions, the way that we do business, and so we can achieve positive peace by peacemaking in effective ways and by peace building, where we do start to address some of those wider issues that create conflict, distress, suffering for people in schools and within the wider society.
Great, thank you. Emma, do you have anything to add at that point?
So I think we could also consider positive peace as your inner thought process, your inner well-being, and how you maintain this at a central level. Or at least that is what I would embody peace to be. And outwardly, that shines out as love, affection, and being one with one another, being one with nature, being one with the cosmos. I mean, that sounds quite deep, but that's my understanding of positive peace.
So if I could add to that, that's so central, Hema. So I've been doing peace work ever since I was a teacher, a long time ago, back in the late 80s, early 90s, and I realised that peace is a really useful concept as an educator, because you start with inner peace. You start with yourself. And then you move into your close relationships with your friends, with your family. And then beyond that, you move into your community, into your locality, and then up to nation, region, up to the entire planet. And so it's a concept that is multi-scalar from the classroom right the way through to the globe. So I've been doing this work now for 35 years in lots of different ways. And my aim is to help to build peaceful classrooms, peaceful schools, so that we can have peaceful communities, peaceful nations, and work towards global peace.
Excellent. And we're covering a little bit now that we'll definitely talk about later. So moving on, how important is positive peace to the future of education, do you think? Who wants to start on that one?
I think it's vitally important for the future of education. I feel peace education and practice is integral to developing an understanding of what's important. The next generation will need to focus on repairing the planet and undoing the mess that we've created so far. If they also wish to maintain peaceful lives as nations and help the current climate and the crisis around that, I think education is the best place to start.
Excellent.
I think, if you were to ask yourself, what is the goal of education? Surely it's to enable someone to feel at peace with themselves, and at peace in their relationships, and at peace with the wider environment. And there are ways that you can teach young people to be able to manage conflicts better. For example, to start a conversation with somebody that they have a difficulty with I rather than you. Very, very simple, but there are ways of using language that we can share with young people, which mean they're much more likely to be able to resolve the conflicts positively than negatively. Conflict itself isn't good or bad. It just is. It's the way that we respond to it. We can either respond to conflict destructively, in which case it can escalate into violence and into separation, or we can deal with conflict constructively, which means that we can access all the many gifts, actually, that conflict brings to help us to make positive changes in ways that meet everybody's needs. But it's not straightforward how that actually happens. And I don't think that we do enough in schools at the moment in order to teach young people actively how to respond to the many multiple conflicts that they face within their schools, within their communities, and that they will increasingly face as we move into an ever more chaotic world with the effects of the climate emergency, growing global inequality, huge levels of migration, no doubt, in the future as we start to get climate refugees. We are going to have to, the children that we're educating today are going to have to be able to live with each other in respectful, tolerant and peaceful ways, because I'm afraid that the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. Mm. The nature of the problem, and I think maybe Hema can say a little bit more about that, and then perhaps I can follow on with some, once we understand the nature of the problems, what we might do about it.
Yeah, so with the help of Professor Hilary Cremin and colleague Roy Layton, we have developed some audit tools which gather perceptions from students, teachers and staff at a school against a peace matrix. The audit questionnaires are designed to be used by the whole school, so questions are appropriate for learners from age 6 and above. We're beginning a pilot of these tools with our international schools so that we can ascertain whether they're appropriate for the international context, and we will be gathering their feedback. The process is for school leaders to administer these questionnaires at their schools and for us to provide them with some feedback on the findings. And then produce a high-level report and opportunity to discuss the data in further detail. We'll then follow up with a programme which offers school leaders the opportunity to be immersed in the strategies and techniques delivered by Hilary and Roy, and a further opportunity to develop a future school improvement plan.
Great. You mentioned the word peace matrix, which sounds intriguing to me. Are you able to talk about that a little bit more?
I think the best person to explain that is actually Hilary.
Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit more about the peace matrix?
Yes, I wish I could show you a whiteboard now. So I'm going to have to do it with my words. So if you could imagine a table, a word table or an Excel table with columns and rows.
We can pop this in the links as well at the end.
Okay. So down the rows. At the bottom, you've got peacekeeping. And as I was saying earlier, that's to address direct conflict and violence. And it's almost, that's the level which is the most basic in order to promote safety and human rights or children's rights within schools. Really important. It's about feelings of safety, and it's about protecting children from themselves and from each other in the extreme, in situations in which people might be put at risk. After peacekeeping, then we have peacemaking. So that's the next row up, and peacemaking is about putting things right when a conflict has occurred, just as you would understand from the normal use of the word to make peace. Yeah. Our work is to move peacemaking away from what often happens in schools, which is punitive methods or teacher-imposed solutions to conflict, over to young people being educated in how to manage conflict themselves. Because we feel that if young people learn in schools how to manage conflict effectively and positively, they're going to take those skills with them as they move out into their families and workplaces. So, for example, the topic of my PhD is peer mediation. How do we support young people to mediate their playground disputes for each other? Also, restorative approaches to discipline that teachers might use. How could teachers, for example, ask young people who might have been harmed by something that they've done and what they can do to put it right, rather than the teacher telling the student off and then the teacher imposing some kind of sanction. So it's to get young people to become moral and ethical thinkers so that they begin to behave in certain ways because they understand the value of behaving in those ways, not because they're frightened of a sanction or because they're expecting a reward. So that's the peacemaking element of it. And on the top row, you have peace building. So the other two are more reactive, but peace building is proactive. So how do we build capacity within schools, within institutions, to be able to use these methods to respond constructively and creatively to conflict? So some of that is going to be some of the training that I've been talking about earlier. Some of it might be thinking about some of the structural and cultural violence that might be within the school or within the community that might need to be addressed through preventative type projects. So the peace building is quite open-ended and will depend on the community and on what the needs are. The rows, the columns, go, as we were saying earlier, from inner peace through to outer peace, through to community and global, through to ecological. So if you can picture that table, you can see that each of those columns intersect with a row, and in each of those rows there are sets of activities that schools can undertake, and also a set of descriptors of behaviours that you might expect to see if there were positive peace in a school. So that's how we've developed our audit tool, so that schools can begin to see across all of those areas the extent to which young people feel safe, have a sense of belonging, and feel they know how to address conflict, and feel that they're building towards positive peace in their school and in their environment.
Excellent. Could you give us maybe one example of one of these activities within a column or box?
Yeah, so within the inner peace, for example, within peace building, it may be that schools want to focus on young people's sense of calm and well-being. And that might be through mindfulness activities, or it might be through focusing on breathing, learning how to use breath. So this doesn't have to be esoteric and something which people might feel is a real hippie type activity. It can actually be to help in preparation for exams, to become calm, to be a confident speaker. So to support young people to be mindful, to achieve a sense of well-being is really important, especially in today's world where we know that levels of depression, anxiety amongst young people are really ramping up. We can work with them to focus on inner peace. And schools can think of their own ways depending on who they've got and what the interests are of the staff and the local community to build projects towards inner peace.
That sounds fantastic. I suppose it sounds like giving the students the power to dictate their own peace.
A lot of this is about preparing young people to be global citizens who are confident, happy, resilient, capable of making their own choices. I think sometimes schools have become institutions that are based on the factory or the military, and in which we really, in the last century, education was very much about preparing young people to be punctual, to have nice handwriting so they could copy things out, so they didn't answer back to their bosses, for them to be very conformist. And I really don't think that that's what we need for the 21st century. I think we need to be preparing young people as critical thinkers, capable of taking responsibility for their actions, capable of negotiating with others, and capable of working towards peace globally and locally.
No, of course. And thinking back to my education, this isn't, I suppose, what subject do you teach that in?
Yeah, exactly. It needs to be across the entire curriculum. You can do this work in maths. You can do cooperative maths games. You can look at some statistics that are often misunderstood around probability and risk and those sorts of issues. If maths is more contextualised, young people want to solve problems because they care about the issues that they're looking into. Similar with science. It doesn't just have to be in personal social health education or sort of siloed in the English curriculum where we learn about empathy. It actually needs to be across the entire curriculum.
I think it's also worth adding that there is a rise in issues around student behaviour these days. Either students are coming back from COVID feeling isolated, having been isolated for those 2 years, and don't know quite how to cope with that, don't know how to cope with their emotions, don't know how to express how they're actually feeling. But equally, the dichotomy that they're feeling is resulting in student behaviour and manifesting in things like bullying and anger towards one another, which is on the rise, unfortunately. So this is something else that we want to address as part of an education setting, is helping schools to deal with those student behaviour issues that they're finding that are problematic. And equally among adults as well, as we see teachers not being able to cope with how they're feeling under pressure, they're feeling that they can't cope with the stresses of the modern day or their working environment or, the students that they have in front of them, they're helping them actually to cope as well. So there's lots of areas that we can help develop their strategies.
And I think families as well. I think increasingly schools are picking up issues that from parents who are really struggling, and it's impacting on their children. And so schools are perhaps picking up with a lack of children's services, a lack of wider support. And so their jobs are getting even harder at a time when they themselves don't necessarily have the resources that they need. And so it's a bit of a downward spiral sometimes. And we need to turn that into a virtuous spiral so that we can start to support young people and their parents and support communities.
Okay, virtuous spiral. Could you maybe describe that?
I suppose it's that you can either have, we're talking here about mental health, aren't we? Mental health issues and unhappiness and conflict within families, within communities, parents feeling very stressed because of the affordability of their living standards and so on. It's not that those problems can be solved by schools, but schools can certainly support young people and families in order to feel a sense of belonging and community come together to support each other and to develop resilience. And I think although many schools will say, gosh, there's as much as we can do to get our young people through their exams and we're not social workers, on the other hand, those schools that do manage to support parents and communities through various initiatives and projects, that then impacts on the well-being of children, which then impacts on their exam results, as well as their life chances and opportunities. And I think we do need to remember in schools that we're about holistic education. We're not just about assessing subject content in order to be able to compete in local and global league tables. Our children are not commodities to make us look good. They're our future, and we owe it to them to ensure that the communities that they're moving into are healthy and thriving.
Okay, so final question for you both. We've sort of touched on this before, but what do you see as the short and long-term benefits? So to teachers, to schools, and to society from the conversations we just had? Who wants to start on that one?
So in the short term, we want to hopefully see through this pilot and through the discussions, through the trials that we're running, whether the tools are contextually appropriate and whether we can offer them at a global level. One of the reasons we want to do this pilot internationally is to make sure that the questions that we're asking are appropriate for that international audience. In developing a tool like this and a service around it, the short-term benefits that we want to see will be positive impact on student well-being, on teacher well-being, and then the ripple effect on its local community. In the long term, we want to see the benefits being us moving towards our ultimate goal, which will be to reach global peace. And I think this is a challenge we're rising to.
Just a small goal, then. Hilary?
I mean, some of the outcomes are self-evident from the discussion so far, but perhaps I'll just talk about one or two schools who've been doing this work through my previous activities over the years. And I think what I've noticed is that young people who are used to sitting in circles, taking it in turns, listening to each other, cooperating, thinking about their responsibility to their classmates and towards their climate for learning, is they tend to certainly do better academically. They seem happier. Their teachers feel that it's not their only responsibility to impose discipline. They're able to talk to young people, so we get greater levels of maturity. The schools that we've worked in the past, the results have been noted by Ofsted. Schools have drastically reduced their levels of exclusion, whether we're talking about permanent exclusion or whether we're talking about internal exclusion. Young people talk about their school as a family. They talk about their feeling of belonging. Several young people that I've worked with many decades ago have got back to me to say that having been playground mediators, they now are doing this work as lawyers or as mediators in the community. I think it inspires young people to think about themselves as empowered global citizens. And I think also when it comes to teachers themselves, they start to feel that the process of relationship building, of who they are in the classroom, matters as much as the content of what they're teaching. And they feel empowered to be mentors for young people, to practice what they preach and to experiment with how they can be authentic with the young people in their care in order to build stronger communities. And so I'm really hoping that through this collaboration with Cambridge that we're going to be able to take this work to the next level and really begin to scale up and create a family of schools who are able to support each other to do this work and to share the benefits of it.
That's great. And you used the word authenticity then, which I think is fantastic, because surely if a teacher can be their most authentic self in the classroom, then the students are getting the best out of them. Because
absolutely. And they can be authentic themselves.
Yeah.
And we move away from this idea that every single 12-year-old needs to have reached exactly the same outcome in order for us to have quality assurance. You know, children are not factory products. They all need to be authentic to who they are and explore their unique gifts. And that's my vision for education, that young people discover what it is that they can do and that they make that contribution to their society.
If we can see a short-term culture shift, then again, that is another short-term benefit of this process. So changing the culture in schools, changing the culture in people's homes and communities, to be more conscious about what we're doing, and mindful about how we approach life is obviously something that we want to aim to do.
think that's a good place to end. Very noble sentiment to end on. Unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you to Hilary and to Hema for being fantastic guests. Don't forget to tell your friends about this podcast and rate our show on whatever platform you're listening on. The show notes have lots of useful links that we've discussed today, so don't forget to check out those linked within. Remember to follow us on Twitter at CUP Education and use the hashtag BrighterPod if you want to get in touch in the future. Finally, thank you very much to our guests. Do you want to say goodbye to the listeners?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.